It's not often that you see this man, the one leaning against the skyline, forging his way across the unforgiving landscape of existence. That person is a Sigma male, a distinct figure in the social game who is frequently ignored and misinterpreted. Herman Melville once said, "It is better to fail in originality than to succeed in imitation." These words immediately spring to mind. And for Sigma males, that is evident and accurate. They create their roots, but because of this unusual trip, it's sometimes misinterpreted that Sigma males don't have any friends. But the unpleasant reality of this assertion is more nuanced than meets the eye. These guys are masters at entertaining themselves, and unlike many of us, they don't yearn for social validation. Because of this, they stand out from the crowd and are less likely to be seen at regular social gatherings. This trait is frequently misinterpreted as being unfriendly. However, keep in mind Henry David Thoreau's wise words, "The man who goes alone can start today, but he who travels with another must wait till that other is ready." Walking alone increases the likelihood of discovering uncharted territory. As the lone walkers, Sigma males discover their journeys that don't necessarily align with society's misunderstanding of what friendship is. We're going to dissect the harsh truth of why Sigma males appear to be flying solo nowadays. The first thing to know about Sigma males is that they live a nomadic lifestyle. They have no ties and are always moving from one place to another. Liberty. New beginnings. The excitement of novel encounters. Hold on, though, there are drawbacks to this way of life. It's not that Sigma males are incapable of making friends, don't get me wrong. They have a knack for it, they can read people, fit in with various settings, and get along. The problem is that they're always moving. Real friendships require time and shared experiences, two things that Sigma males don't seem to stay around for. Imagine yourself constantly moving, never remaining still long enough to establish lasting relationships. Those friendships are always left behind when you move on, out of sight, out of mind. Not to mention the work involved in adjusting each time you set foot in a new location. As a stranger, you're still coming to know yourself and learning the social norms. It wears me out. There is only so much energy in the world, and a lot of it is expended in beginning anew. I've been there before. The excitement of the novel wears off and you're left sitting by yourself in an unfamiliar environment. The price you pay for this independence begins to seep in. The truth with Sigma males is that they lead a life that appears to be free but is one of isolation and constant pursuit of goals that leave little time for other pursuits. The truth is that Sigma males are not like other people. They don't start the talks, break the ice, or take the initiative. No, that's not how they roll. Have you ever observed from a comfortable seat in a crowded room? It's not necessary to leap into the light, as Sigma men seem to do. They like they're alone and are more than happy to observe from the sidelines. They just don't feel the intense urge to constantly initiate contact first, which doesn't imply they're antisocial or don't love company. In case you're asking yourself, what's the big deal? I'll wait for someone to come up to me. This is when things become tricky. Individuals are not mind readers. Sigma males tend to be reclusive and reticent, which might lead to misunderstandings. They may believe you're uninterested and would rather be left alone. Before you realize it, people stop making the effort and attempting to connect. What occurs after that? It's not that you can't make friends or that others dislike you, rather, the reason you're left out is because your quiet is misinterpreted. You find yourself trapped in this circle, with no one reaching out to you and no one reaching in. I've been there, so I know. People perceived me as distant and aloof because of my silence. They misinterpreted my stillness and failed to see that I was just happy being by myself, ready to connect if someone reached out. Believe me when I say that having realized you've put yourself in a box by not taking the initiative is a difficult pill to swallow. Their quiet may act as a barrier preventing them from making new friends. Maintaining their innate proclivities without coming across as aloof or uninterested is a difficult balance to strike. However, this is only a portion of the whole image of Sigma males, as always. Have you ever been engrossed in a great book while everyone else is having a blast? Alternatively, perhaps you needed to travel alone and leave the group behind. You're connecting with the spirit of the Sigma males if you can relate. They find time spent alone exhilarating rather than depleting, and they thrive on it. They discover that their creativity is sparked, their minds are aligned, and their spirits are lifted during these peaceful times. However, they are losing out on the common occurrences that bring people together, barbecues, parties, and game nights, while they are preoccupied with getting through the woods or getting lost in a book. It is in these places that memories and friendships are created. Although they don't actively seek them out, Sigma guys aren't against these hobbies either. They would rather trek alone in peace than attend a boisterous party. You may ask yourself, so what? In any case, I like to hang out alone. Let me tell you, though, this inclination is not always understood by everyone. Your absence from group activities might be interpreted by others as a sign of disinterest or a refusal to interact. Before you realize it, you start receiving invites from individuals who think you're antisocial. It doesn't follow that Sigma males don't respect friendships just because they prefer to be alone. However, their love of isolation may give the impression that they are loners, which would be a misrepresentation of who they are. The truth is that Sigma males' DNA has a type of detector. They want the same thing in their relationships because they are true to themselves. Therefore, they will leave you faster than you can say phony if you give off any sort of artificial feeling. Let me explain. We all participate in some small conversation in our fast-paced world. A few courteous nods here, a few forced grins there. These contacts at the surface function as the social wheels oil. It's something we all do, and it's not always a negative thing. However, it's a whole other story for a Sigma male. Sigma males dig deep instead of playing on the surface. They are looking for meaningful relationships, meaningful conversations that transcend trivial topics like the weather or the newest sporting event. You know, those two in-the-morning talks that disclose souls, show truths, and expose weaknesses. That's where they play. They would rather squander a full day on small chat than spend an hour having a meaningful discussion. This is the tough part, though. Their need for genuine relationships causes them to surround themselves with fewer people. Their phone vibrating with hundreds of contacts doesn't bother them. They would rather have a small group of reliable pals who have a better understanding of them. Sigma males, they're not swimmers on the surface. They want relationships that go beyond the newest rumors about celebrities or the outcome of the most recent football game. They're all about those in-depth, late-night conversations that allow you to show off your soul by removing the layers and exposing the unvarnished realities. Don't distort what I just said. They don't oppose socialization. Simply put, they don't put up with anything phony, shallow, or disingenuous. It might also give the impression that they don't have any pals. The truth is, though, that even while they may have fewer friends overall, the relationships they forge are among the strongest. Although their social circle may be rather limited, the friendships they develop are authentic and unadulterated. For them, it's more about quality than quantity and less about statistics. The Sigma male code is that. In their friendships, they won't accept anything less. A few genuine ties are preferred over a large group of uninformed acquaintances. Even while it can mean having fewer friends, in my opinion, that's just being wise and not a compromise. By now, you've undoubtedly seen this. Sigma males don't merely follow the crowd. They don't give a damn about the newest fads or trends that everyone is hyping up. They follow their route. Although they appear to be lost, they are following their path and are not lost at all. Let's face it, our culture is obsessed with the newest gadgets, fashions, gossip, and everything in between. These kinds of mutual interests serve as the cornerstone of most friendships, providing a common link between the parties involved. However, a Sigma male isn't into all that crap. Forming relationships might be difficult because of their disinterest in popular culture. You shouldn't expect them to become as excited about your latest Netflix series or the new iPhone as you do. It's just not how they do things. They have their hobbies and interests, and they won't pretend to like anything to fit in. Now, this might give the impression that they are less of friends because of their disinterest in following trends and engaging in popular culture. It can make their social circle smaller. But hear me out, this has nothing to do with their being obstinate or distant. They are staying loyal to who they are and not giving in to the pressure to fit in. Thus, although demonstrating their honesty, their disinterest in popular culture may make it more difficult for them to interact and share experiences. But be aware that they are not seeking to fill their lives with transitory relationships based on the fad of the day. Hear me out, Sigma males don't follow the crowd, instead, they forge their route. They follow their own set of rules and refuse to accept the consequences. They are not here to fit into a mold or follow a script. Indeed, they might not be the most popular person in the group, the life of the party, or the greatest friend of everyone. However, individuals who have a true understanding and familiarity with them would not swap them for anything. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed learning about Sigma males and want more insightful content, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video. Stay tuned for the next one by checking your screen. Your support fuels our exploration of diverse topics. Thanks for being part of our community.